who is the God of Freemasonry, and what God do Freemasons exactly believe in? I'm going to reveal to you everything you need to know about the God of Freemasonry. My name's Right Worshipful Brother Darren Allatt, and welcome to Daily Masonic Progress. But first, we need to understand that Freemasonry has been around for centuries, and long before the age of information that we live in today. But that same age of information has also brought along the age of misinformation. Now, if you're a Freemason like myself, you would have come across many people arguing that the great architect of the universe is the God of Freemasonry, that this God competes with the God. Now, I see these arguments mostly from people with a Christian background. I'm a Christian, mind you. However, I'm sure there are people of many faiths or other religious beliefs that make the same arguments against Freemasonry. And as Freemasons, we shouldn't let this misinformation fester because it's malignant, especially with the high speed and global reach of technology. So I'm going to address the many factors about God, which will hopefully now make us all well informed and be able to at least correct this misinformation. But we won't actually be able to change the minds of those who spread it. Rather, we should aim to correct it for those who come across it, either in their search for light or through the different social media algorithms pushing it out to a wider audience. So let's start with the obvious. Who is the God of Freemasonry? Well, Freemasonry does not have a God. Freemasonry does not have any gods. Freemasonry is not a religion, and Freemasonry has no religion. Freemasonry has no affiliation to any religion, nor is it a substitute or even attempting to be a religion. Therefore, there is no God of Freemasonry, and anyone who claims that the great architect of the universe is the God of Freemasonry is the same person that will tell you 1 + 1 = 5. But why is it that in Freemasonry, we have references to the great architect of the universe then? Well, the simplest way to think about the great architect of the universe is not to think of it as a name for God, because this would imply a substitute. Rather, it's actually a title used by Freemasonry to give reverence to the God of a Mason's own individual faith. To give you a more simple parable to daily life, the title president is given to the head of a country or maybe a company. Now, if you're American, when someone says the president, you give that title reference to the president of the United States and the person who is in that office. And if you're Argentinian, for example, when someone says the president, you might give the title reference to the president of Argentina. If you work at McDonald's and are in a work meeting and someone says the president, well, you're giving the title, the reference to the president of McDonald's. So when a Mason of any faith or any religion hears the term, the great architect of the universe, his heart is hearing the God of his own religion, his own faith, and his own beliefs. But aren't the teachings of Freemasonry religious? Well, Freemasonry teaches moral principles and lessons of self-development, and they're based upon a combination of two things. That morality is defined by the Creator and not man. And those moral lessons come from a book known as the Book of Law, or the volume of sacred law, which is of each Mason's own individual faith. Now, Masonry is not superseding those laws, rather reinforcing them and encouraging each Mason to strictly follow the laws of his own faith. Freemasonry is constantly directing the Mason to his own faith. So for lessons in morality and virtue, a brother who is Christian is being directed back to Christianity. A brother who is Jewish is being directed towards Judaism. And a brother who is Muslim is being directed to Islam. And this is the same that applies to brethren of the many other different religious or faiths. And then we have the practical lessons of how to live that can be learned from examples in these biblical books, as well as those of the operative stonemasons from time immemorial. And this is the same as to how you learn at work or at school or doing a course about finance, about project management, leadership, communication. These are all things that can be applied in your personal life. It's like doing a module on ethics in a law degree. It's not in competition with the morality of your own faith or your religion. It is there to reinforce it. So if this is the case where Freemasonry is not a religion, rather a philosophy, well, how do you explain the use of the Bible inside of Freemasonry? Well, to understand this, we need to understand which biblical books our craft degrees are based on. And although there are elements and stories from other Old Testament books featured in the craft degrees, such as how the first degree includes aspects from the book of Ruth, but the book that is central to each degree is, for the first degree in Freemasonry, the book of Genesis. The second degree in Freemasonry or fellowcraft is the book of Exodus. And the third or sublime degree of a Master Mason is the book of 1 and 2 Kings. Now, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all respect and share key elements of the Old Testament, including those books used by Masonry for the craft degrees that I just mentioned. And while those religions have their own theological differences, they also acknowledge the holiness and importance of these books. The craft degrees pretty much stop at the end of Kings and Chronicles, whilst Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all then diverge theologically thereafter as well. But we also need to remember that the book of law for each faith is present in the lodge room, so each brother can be directed towards their own faith at the appropriate moments. The Holy Bible, the Quran, and the Torah, plus the many volumes of sacred law or sacred religious texts for the other faith, are also present during the ceremonies. But it depends upon the religion of each of the brothers that are members of that lodge. The next argument that is often brought up is the absence of Jesus in Freemasonry, and many argue that Jesus is foretold right across the Old Testament. So why doesn't he appear in craft masonry? Now, I do have a separate video on this, which I'll touch on at the end. Well, I want to give you an example that we can all relate to, one that is something apparent in everyday life. And I'm going to use Harry Potter. So sorry to spoil it if you haven't read any of the Harry Potter books or you haven't watched all the movies. You see, in the 6th book of the Harry Potter series is when you find out that Harry is one of the 7 Horcruxes. They're magical objects containing parts of Voldemort, who is the villain's soul, that need to be destroyed in order to defeat the bad guy and save the world. And once you learn that in the 6th book, a lot of things that were foretold or signposted in the preceding 5 books now are very obvious, and they all make sense. Now, the reason why I say this is a rude example is it's the best sort of pop culture reference that I can use where we can separate the emotional and spiritual attachment of religion and we can reframe how we think about this. And in this example, well, it does fail to acknowledge the theological differences and divergences across the different religions, which would be bringing religion into Masonry, and I'm already treading a fine line here. So let's bring this back to Masonry. It's only after the craft degrees, the first 3, and specifically in the Christian orders of Masonry, is Jesus then mentioned. Well, why is he then still not mentioned in the craft degrees? Well, here is why. You see, Freemasonry specifically restricts us Masons from obtaining the knowledge of any higher degree until we've fully understood our current and preceding degrees, and then we've been advanced to that higher degree accordingly. And to explain this in the context of what I'm trying to paint here is, if you were to have had your memory completely wiped and the only thing that you were given was an Old Testament, and you can still read, you can still comprehend, but you have just no memory of anything. If you open up on page 1, anything that is foretold is not going to be apparent until you reach the New Testament. And what this does is it teaches you to take everything in its immediate context and to build a deep understanding of it until you're given further information later on. Meanwhile, imagine if you had just started reading Harry Potter for the first time and are only on page 1 of the first book. Now, since I've told you all the key plot twists from the 6th book, the whole thing is now spoiled. And this is exactly the same as what Christians do when they talk about Jesus, whilst you're on the first page of Genesis. You see, as Christians, when we proclaim the gospel, we start with the hero killing the bad guy and saving the day. We don't let you build up to the story, and then we reframe and tell the story from the perception of why the bad guy gets killed and why he's the savior and why he saves the day. So we basically lead with the spoilers. And this might leave you to think, well, where does this then leave the other men in respect to their own personal beliefs in Masonry? I want to go back to an earlier point. You see, Freemasonry reinforces each Mason to pursue their own individual faith. Masonry redirects them back to their faith when our ceremonies mention the book of law, the great architect, knowledge, wisdom, morality, and virtue, and any other element that is dealt with by his own religion and faith. The religion and faith of the brother is the higher authority. Freemasonry is a subordinate of his own religious beliefs. I want to leave you with this little parting story. An ex-girlfriend of mine was convinced by her mother that a family member was a Mason and he was a victim of Masonic curse and Masonry was evil. Well, there's no such thing as a Masonic curse, but it did teach me a very important lesson. There's no amount of actual truth that will ever compete with the authority of her mother in her heart. And this means as Freemasons, we need to realize that we're not going to change the minds of people who want to believe the misinformation, despite how much we try to correct it and we present the truth and the facts. They're just not prepared in their heart. And many will place authority and credibility on what is written on the internet by some strangers whose credentials you cannot verify, and you can't even verify their identity. But the thing is, we can be armed with knowledge and truth and light and share as much of Masonry as we're allowed to, so that those who are prepared in their heart will hear the truth and not fall victim to this misinformation. But now that we understand God and Freemasonry, this might leave you with two questions, especially if you've been reading about stuff on the internet. You might have more questions about Jesus in Freemasonry. Well, watch this video here. And if you've fallen into the trap of believing that Freemasonry is satanic, watch this video here.